Thanks so much. It is always an honor and a privilege to be at this great church. I mean, Bob Russell and Dave Stone and Kyle Eidelman are heroes of mine. They are some of the finest men and finest leaders in the land, and I admire them so much, and I'm thrilled with what God has done in this great church through the decades, so thank you for having me. I get these days to travel around the world and talk about Jesus, so it's a great thing, but I've had some embarrassing things happen along the way. One of them was down south. I was speaking at a conference with my buddy Mark, and the next day we had to go home and we had to get breakfast. And so we saw one of these Cracker Barrel restaurants. You ever been to a Cracker Barrel restaurant? I'd never been to one. So we said, we got to give it a try. I said, all right. So we noticed they have rocking chairs on the front porch where people sit and they people watch while they're waiting for their meal. So in order for us to get to the front door, we had to walk in front of two people in rocking chairs. First one was a young woman about 18 years old, dark hair, dark eyes, young man sitting next to her about the same age. So we had to walk in front of them to get to the door. That's not a big deal, right? So we're walking along, and just as I step in front of this young woman, I hear her say, "What's a deist?" And I thought I just wrote a book about that. So I turned on my heel, I looked in the eyes, I said, "Young lady, a deist is someone who believes that God created the universe," and then he walked away. I said, a deist is someone who believes that God sort of wound up the universe like a giant clock and is just letting it tick down. I said, a deist is someone who believes that God is distant and disinterested in us. But I said, that's not what the evidence shows. And began to give the evidence for God's involvement with the cosmos, God's involvement with humankind. Talk about the evidence of cosmology and physics and biochemistry. I'm just laying this stuff on her. And she's looking at me, and her eyes are getting bigger and bigger. And I'm on a roll now. You can't stop me. Talking about Jesus entering into human history. I talked about the incarnation, his miracles, his death. I started to give her the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And she's staring at me, and her eyes are getting bigger and bigger. And I turned to my friend, I said, "Could you believe this?" I happened to walk in front of her. She said, "What's a deist?" My friend said, "Lee." She said, "Buenos dias." I wish that were a joke. That's exactly what happened. It was so embarrassing. But you know what the good news was? The ice was already broken. How do you not get into a spiritual conversation at that point? Turned out she was there with her boyfriend for the state track meet. And they took us back to the hotel where the coach was and all the athletes, and we got to talk about Jesus for about 45 minutes. So it turned out all right. But man, that was embarrassing. That was embarrassing. Well, tonight, I want to tell you about a discovery that a tech friend of mine brought to me about a year ago or so. He said, "Lee, I've discovered something unusual. I've discovered that 200 times a second around the clock, someone on planet Earth is typing into a computer search engine basically the question, is God real? 200 times a second around the clock." And I said, oh my goodness, that just shows the hunger in the human heart to know whether God is real, because so much depends on that. That is the ultimate question of life, right? There was a famous atheist named William Provine from Cornell University, and he was debating a Christian. And during that debate, he said, "Look, I'm an atheist. I'll just tell you honestly, candidly, that if there is no creator, then 5 things are true. There is no evidence for God. There is no life after death. There is no absolute foundation for right and wrong. There is no absolute meaning for life. And there is no free will." Well, those are some pretty big things, right? I mean, that's why so much hangs on this question, is God real? And yet, a declining number of people in America believe that God is real. Back when my wife Leslie and I met when we were 14 years old, and back in 1966, and back then, 98% of American adults believed that God is real. You know what the number is today? 81%. Lowest it's ever been in American history. And only 6 out of 10 Americans are sure that God exists. But even though that is true statistically, there are some positive signs of curiosity about whether God is real. 3 out of 4 American adults say they want to grow spiritually. And nearly half of American adults say they are more open to God today than they were before the pandemic. And so I've written this new book called Is God Real? To deal with this question. How do we know in our technological and scientific age, how can we be confident that God is real? And then I deal with the 2 biggest objections to that. Number 1, if God is real, why is there suffering in the world? And if God is real, why does he seem so hidden? And so I've written this book. It just came out recently. We have some copies here. I'd love to sign one for you or for a friend. By the way, all the proceeds go to the church. They don't go to me. So, if you're interested in going deeper on what I'm going to talk about tonight, that is an option available to you. But in all, there are about 20 lines of evidence that point toward the existence not just of God, but of the God of Christianity. But to me, having been myself for much of my life an atheist, 3 discoveries in modern science, if I were still an atheist today, would convince me that God exists. So I want to talk about what is the evidence from science? What are these discoveries over the last 50 years or so that frankly make belief in God today more logical and rational than virtually any time in history? What are those discoveries? The first one comes in the area of cosmology, which is a fancy word. All it means is the origin of the universe. Where did the universe come from? And for centuries, scientists believed that the universe was eternal. It always existed. It was always there. But thanks to some persuasive philosophical arguments, but more importantly, a series of scientific discoveries just over the last 50 years or so concerning the expansion of the universe has convinced virtually every scientist on the planet that the universe began to exist at some point in the past. In other words, it came into existence at some point in the past. Alexander Vilenkin, who's one of the great cosmologists in our country, head of the Cosmology Center at Tufts University, said, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. In fact, he and 2 other cosmologists developed a theorem that tells us that any universe that is expanding on average throughout its history like ours is, must have had a beginning. In fact, if it turns out that our universe is just a small part of a much larger multiverse, that multiverse must have had a beginning. And so this has led to one of the most persuasive arguments for the existence of God. It's been popularized by my friend, Dr. William Lane Craig, who has 2 earned PhDs. And it's very simple. This is how it goes. Number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now think about that. Can you think of anything that comes into existence without a cause behind it? No. Even the great skeptic of history, David Hume, said, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. Secondly, we now know the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, the Bible puts it this way. In the very first verse of the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That phrase, heavens and earth, is a Hebrew figure of speech called a merism. And it simply means God created everything. He created the universe. And so cosmology goes a long way toward establishing that God is real. But a common challenge is, well, if God created the universe, then who created God? That's usually followed by na. What about that? Bet you never thought of that. Well, it's just a misunderstanding of the argument. The argument is not whatever exists has a cause. It's whatever began to exist has a cause. God, by definition, is eternal. He never began to exist. He has always existed. In fact, before the universe was created, time didn't even exist. There was simply timelessness. And by the way, atheists shouldn't have a problem believing something is eternal, because they used to believe that the universe was eternal until the scientific evidence disproved them. So based on this, we can draw some conclusions about the cause behind the universe. What conclusions? Well, number 1, he must be transcendent because he exists apart from creation. Number 2, he must be immaterial or spirit because he existed before the physical world came into being. Number 3, he must be timeless or eternal since he existed before physical time was created. 4th, he must be powerful given the immense energy of the creation event. Number 5, he must be smart given the precision of the creation event. He must be personal because he had to make the decision to create. He must be creative because, my goodness, just look at the beauty of the universe. He must be caring or loving because he crafted so perfect a habitat for us to flourish in. And then finally, the scientific principle of Occam's razor would tell us there'd just be just one creator. So what have we got? Look at these qualities: transcendent, spirit, eternal, powerful, smart, personal, creative, caring, unique. That is a description of the God of the Bible. It's a description of the God of the Bible right there. In fact, since there's just one creator, this rules out polytheistic religions, which believe there are many gods. Since the creator is separate from his creation, it rules out pantheistic religions, which say that everything is God. And since the universe is not cyclical, that rules out a lot of Eastern philosophy. So, I mean, this is a powerful argument. Transcendent, spirit, eternal, powerful, smart, personal, creative, loving, unique. That's a description of the God of the Bible. And the case that God is real is then amplified by a second area of science, which is physics. Physics. Psalm 19, verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." And one of the striking discoveries of modern physics has been that the laws and the constants of physics, in other words, the numbers that govern the operation of the universe, unexpectedly conspire in an absolutely extraordinary way so that life can exist. In other words, our universe is finely tuned on a razor's edge so that life can exist. It's like this: if you go out on a summer night, and I'm sure this is true here in Louisville, you go out at night and there's no clouds in the sky and you see thousands of stars. But what if you went out one summer night and instead of seeing thousands of stars, you see 50 to 100 giant dials in the universe? And each one of these dials represents a law or a constant of physics that governs the operation of the universe. And each one of these dials could be set at any one of trillions and trillions of possible settings, and yet every one of these 50 to 100 dials is absolutely perfectly calibrated so that life can exist. That is the picture that modern physics gives us of our universe. How finely tuned is it? I'll give you a couple examples. We all know what the force of gravity is, right? If you drop something, it's going to hit the ground. Well, the force of gravity happens to be set at the exact right value so that life can exist. How precise is it? Imagine a ruler that goes across the entire known universe, 15 billion light years, broken down in 1-inch increments. That is the plausible range along which the force of gravity could have been set anywhere along that dial, and yet it's set at the exact right place so that life can exist. What if we were to change it? What if we were to move it 1 inch compared to the 15 billion light year width of the universe? Intelligent life would be impossible anywhere in the universe. It's mind-blowing. It defies the explanation that this could have just happened by chance. I'll give you another example. The strong nuclear force. That's what binds together the nucleus of an atom. And what's important about that, if you were to change it just by 1 part in 10,000 billion, all we would have in the universe would be hydrogen. Life would be impossible. Or my favorite is the ratio between the electromagnetic force and the gravitational force, which sounds complicated, but what you need to know about it is it has to be exactly finely tuned for life to exist. How finely tuned is it? It is finely tuned to 1 part in 10,000 trillion. Now, how do we understand that number? That would be like taking a continent the size of North America and piling it with dimes all the way to the moon. You got that in your mind? Continents the size of North America, dimes pile up 238,000 miles to the moon. Now picture 1 billion continents the size of North America with dimes piled up 238,000 miles. Now take one dime and spray paint it red and mix it among all those dimes, and then pick one person at random and blindfold them and say, you can move among all these dimes on these billion continents, piled up 238,000 miles, but you can only reach in one time and pick out one dime. What are the odds that would be the dime that had been painted red? One chance in 10,000 trillion, trillion, trillion. I mean, the evidence is so dramatic. They're one of the most prominent physicists in America, Dr. Vera Kistiakowsky. She was a professor of physics at MIT. She was a president of the Association of Women in Science. She said the exquisite order displayed by our scientific understanding of the physical world calls for the divine. In other words, it calls out for God as an explanation. I asked one famous physicist, I said, what are the odds this could have happened just by chance? And he looked at me and said, well, we physicists have a term for that. I said, what is it? He said, ain't gonna happen. And he's right. Now, how do atheists get around this? Well, they do it by saying, well, what if there's actually an infinite number of invisible universes that we don't know about? And if you spin the dials enough times in enough universes, sooner or later, by chance, one of them's gonna hit the lottery, and we're the universe that hit the lottery. That's the explanation. Problem is, there is absolutely no physical evidence for the existence of an infinite number of universes. In fact, recently, one of the most prominent theoretical physicists in the world, a German physicist named Dr. Sabine Hossenfelder, who, by the way, is an agnostic, she said this theory is, in her words, a waste of time from a scientific perspective. She said it's very popular among the media, not so popular among scientists. Besides, think about this. If one universe requires an explanation, then an infinite number of universes requires an even bigger explanation, and that points even more powerfully to God. Friends, honestly, if I were still an atheist today, based on these discoveries over the last 50 or so years, personally, I would be convinced that there's a creator of the universe. But then there's a third area. This has been popularized by Dr. Stephen Meyer, who has a PhD from Cambridge University. And you may remember several years ago, scientists completed the mapping of the human genome. That's the blueprint for life inside every one of our cells. And President Clinton, at the time that they had this breakthrough, said, quote, today we are learning the language in which God created life. And that is exactly right. You see, DNA is quite literally language. Your body has 100 trillion cells in it. Pick one at random and open it up and unwind the famous double helix of DNA, and it would be 6 feet tall. And embedded in that DNA is a 4-letter chemical alphabet that spells out the precise assembly instructions for all of the proteins out of which our bodies are made. I mean, it's unbelievable. In fact, DNA is the most efficient information storage system in the universe. If you were to take 1 teaspoon of DNA, picture peanut butter, and you dip in a teaspoon of pure DNA, that would have the capacity to store all of the information needed to build all of the proteins on all of the 1,000 million species of organisms that have ever existed in our world, and have room left over for the contents of every book that has ever been written in 1 teaspoon of DNA. So how does this point toward a creator? Well, did any of you ever see a movie by the name of Contact? Yeah, somebody did. And not a lot of people saw it. It was Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey in this movie. And the movie was based on a book by an atheist scientist named Carl Sagan. And the idea in the movie, and which is true, is that scientists are using radio telescopes to scan the heavens looking for signs of intelligent life. Don't you wish they would scan Washington, D.C. every once in a while? But that's true. Scientists are scanning the skies looking for signs of intelligent life. That's the true part of the story. But all they're receiving is basically static, the background random noises of the universe. And it's reasonable to assume there's no intelligence behind that. But in the movie, this is a fictional part, in the movie, these radio telescopes start receiving prime numbers, which are numbers divisible only by one or by themselves. And so they conclude there must be an intelligence out there for prime numbers to come through these radio telescopes that way. Why? Because this was not disorganized static. This was information. This was a message with content. And Carl Sagan said the receipt of a single message from space would be enough to know that there is intelligence out there. But what is DNA? It's information. It's a message with content. It's language. It's information. Just as English uses a 26-letter alphabet to spell out words, DNA uses a 4-letter chemical alphabet to spell out the assembly instructions of the proteins out of which we're made. I mean, get this. There is more information in every cell in your body than in 200 years of the Sunday New York Times. I mean, if you were to try to read the code out loud at a pace of 3 letters a second, and you did it night and day, it would take you 31 years to read the information just in one cell in your body. It's the specific, detailed, written instructions for how to build all the proteins out of which your body is made. Where did that come from? Friends, if a single message from space is enough to know that there's an intelligence behind it, what about this vast storehouse of information in every cell in our body? You see, nature by itself can produce patterns. You know, I live in Houston, Texas, and if I go down to the Gulf of Mexico at dawn and the sand is wet and I see ripple marks in the sand, it would be logical for me to conclude that the waves made the ripple marks in the wet sand, right? Because nature can produce patterns like that. But if I'm walking down the beach and in the wet sand I see John loves Mary with a heart around it and an arrow through it, I would never say, oh, the waves created that. Why? Because nature can produce patterns, it can't produce by itself information. And whenever we see information, whether it's a computer code or a newspaper or a painting on a cave wall, always, without exception, there is intelligence behind it. I mean, my personal conclusion, as I said, if I were still an atheist, these 3 areas of science would be enough to convince me that God exists. But then we have to say, well, which God are we talking about? You know, which God? And for that, we turn to another area of study, which is history. History. And the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Why? Because Jesus, in a variety of different ways, made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed to be the Son of God. At one point, he got up before a group like this, and he said, I and the Father are one. And the Greek word for one there is not masculine, it's neuter, which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And how did the audience understand what he was saying? They picked stones to kill him because he said, you're just a man and you're claiming to be God. So Jesus claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. Anybody can claim to be God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth, right? So the resurrection is the linchpin, the foundation of our conviction that Christianity, among all the possible religions, is the one that fits the evidence, not just of science, but also of history. So let me summarize the evidence. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. As I say, the book goes into all the sources on this. But Easter is coming up, right? Next month. You ready for Easter? It's next month. Yeah, 31st of March this year. So Easter begins with the letter E, so I'm going to use 4 words that begin with the letter E to summarize the evidence for the resurrection. And again, I'll go through pretty quickly, but all the stuff is in the book. The first E stands for execution, that Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. I used to think as an atheist, well, maybe he survived, and maybe the cool, damp air of the tomb revived him. And so that's not a resurrection, that's just a resuscitation. That's what I thought. But I looked at the evidence. What did I find? Number 1, we have no evidence anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. Secondly, most of what we accept as being true from the ancient world is based, when you get down to it, to one source of information, or maybe 2 sources of information. And yet, for the death of Jesus, his execution by crucifixion, we not only have multiple first-century accounts in the New Testament, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible for his execution. I mean, get this, no less of a source than the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus, and this was their conclusion, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." I mean, you could go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann of Vanderbilt, and he'll tell you this, quote, "Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable." That's the atheist scholar speaking. So the first E is execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for the word early. We have early reports or accounts that Jesus rose from the dead. In other words, reports have come so quickly after his death that you can't write it off as being a legend that grew up maybe 100, 150, 200 years after his life. Get this will blow your mind. We have preserved for us an account of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses, that has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death. That is a news flash from ancient history. When you consider the first 2 biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch, written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. This goes back within months. Historians drool over this stuff. So we have early reports. We've also got reports in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the book of Acts, that all date back right there to the 1st century. They were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries, who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up. So we've got an execution. Jesus was dead. We have reports of his resurrection that are so early, so immediate, that I don't think you can write them off as a legend that developed over time, especially when you look at maybe the greatest classical historian who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford and Cambridge. And he studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world, and he said the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. The third E stands for the word empty. We have an empty tomb. The historical record tells us that Jesus' body was placed in a tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, member of the Jewish council. It's sealed. Matthew tells us it's guarded, and yet it's discovered empty that first Easter morning. Now, I could go on all night for all the historical data that convinces us the tomb was empty, but I'm just going to give you one fact, because to me this is conclusive, and that's this. Even the enemies of Jesus admitted that the tomb was empty. How do we know? Because we know from sources inside and outside the New Testament that when the disciples began proclaiming that Jesus had risen, what the enemies of Jesus said was, the disciples stole the body. Now think about that. What is that? That's a cover story. They're implicitly admitting the tomb is empty. They're trying to explain how it got empty. You see what I mean? It's like if you're a student or a teacher, and a student comes up to you and says, "The dog ate my homework." That student's admitting, "Look, I don't have my homework, but I can tell you what happened to it. The dog ate it." It's the same thing. So implicitly or explicitly, the followers of Jesus, the enemies of Jesus, everybody in the 1st century was conceding that the tomb was empty. That's not the question of history. The question of history is, how did it get empty? And you go through the usual list of suspects. The Romans weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus dead. The religious leaders of the day weren't about to steal the body. They wanted Jesus to stay dead. The disciples weren't about to steal the body. They didn't have the motive, they didn't have the means, and they didn't have the opportunity. In fact, I found 7 ancient sources, 6 of them outside the Bible, that confirm that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen from the dead. They were willing clearly to die for this conviction. Why? Because someone told them in Sunday school class that Jesus had risen? No, because they were there. They talked to him, they touched him, they ate with them. Of all human beings who've ever lived, they knew the truth for sure. They were there. And knowing the truth, they were willing to suffer and even to die for it. That tells me something about the depth of their conviction. And then finally, the 4th word that begins with the letter E is the word eyewitnesses. Not only was Jesus' tomb discovered empty, but over a period of time, he appears alive in a dozen different instances to more than 515 people. To skeptics and doubters, as well as to believers. To men, to women, to groups, to individuals, indoors, outdoors, daytime, nighttime. They touched them, they talked with them, they ate with them. I mean, think about this. Remember I said earlier, when we look at ancient history, there are things that we believe happened in ancient history. We're convinced they did. And when you get down to it, it's based on one source, or maybe 2 sources. And yet, for the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. Friends, that is an avalanche of historical data. And in my book, I interviewed Dr. Michael Licona, one of the great resurrection scholars in the world. He goes through these sources. But how convincing is this? Does it only convince evangelical Christians that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, let me tell you about a guy. When I was an atheist and a student at Yale Law School, my hero was a guy who was identified in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful lawyer on the planet. Do we have any lawyers here tonight? Not too many, okay. Let me blow your mind. This guy, as a defense attorney, won 245 murder trials in a row, either before the jury or on appeal. Unbelievable. Nobody's ever done that. He's in the Guinness Book of World Records, the most successful lawyer who ever lived. And like me, he was a skeptic about the resurrection. And you think about it. Here's a guy that knows what constitutes reliable evidence, right? Here's a guy who's used to taking what looks like an airtight case against his client and finding all the loopholes, all the problems with that. He was knighted twice by Queen Elizabeth, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court of his land. Well, one day, somebody came up to him and said, Sir Lionel, his name was Sir Lionel Luckhoo. He said, Sir Lionel, you're the greatest lawyer who's ever lived. Have you ever taken your monumental legal skills and applied it to the historical record for the resurrection of Jesus and come to an informed conclusion about whether he really returned from the dead? And he said, no, I haven't, but I will. And so he spent years researching it through his legal expertise. And I'll recite to you one sentence he wrote that summarized his conclusion. Quote, I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. This from the most successful lawyer in the world. And I came to the same conclusion on November the 8th of 1981. After my wife became a Christian and I tried to rescue her from this cult by disproving the resurrection, I spent 2 years of my life using my journalism training and legal training to investigate the evidence, and I came to the same conclusion. And then I read a verse, John 1:12. Interesting verse. It says, yet to as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I noticed that verse forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus receive equals become. So I said, okay, I get it. I believe based on the data of history that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. He backed it up by returning from the dead. I get it. I believe it. It's not enough. It's not enough. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I would receive this free gift of his grace, then I would become a child of God. And so I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God. And over time, my morality, my character, my values, my relationships, my worldview, my philosophy, my parenting, my marriage, all these things over time began to change for the good. Now, as I say, I just wrote this book, Is God Real?, to try to help Christians deepen their own faith, but then maybe to read it and then give it away to someone who's spiritually curious and so forth. But I thought I can't write a book like this without dealing with the number one objection that people raise to the God being real. And that is, if God is real, why is there suffering? This is a personal question, right? Not just an intellectual exercise. My wife traveled with me here today, but she's not here tonight. She's at the hotel. She suffers from a neuromuscular condition, and she has been in pain every day for 20 years. And she will be in pain every day for the rest of her life. This is an incurable condition, unless God does a miracle, which he has not chosen to do in our case. And so this question of why God allows suffering is a personal issue, maybe for you too. And so I interviewed one of the world's leading philosophers on this question, Dr. Peter Kraft. And I'm telling you, the wisdom, the depth, the character, the biblical fidelity, the brilliance of this guy, when I interviewed him, it's like a 25-page chapter. And if you wrestle with this, I urge you, get the book free from the library, I don't care. But read this interview with him to help really get a handle on why the existence of suffering can be consistent with Christianity. Because guess what? Every worldview has to deal with this, not just Christianity. Atheists have to wrestle with this too. And by the way, it doesn't negate the 20 lines of evidence that point toward the truth of Christianity. It doesn't negate those. So we got to keep that in mind. But it's an important question. And you know what? Jesus was honest about it. If you go to many Eastern religions, you know what they'll tell you why you're suffering? They'll say, oh, suffering, that's Maya. That's an illusion. Baloney. My wife's suffering is not an illusion. It is very real. But Jesus was honest. Jesus said in John 16:33, he said, in this world, you will have trouble. Why? Because we live in a world corrupted by sin. How does that work out? Well, God has existed from eternity past as God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit in a perfect love relationship. And therefore, the greatest value in the entire universe is love. And when God decided, I want to create humankind, he wanted to give us the ability to love him and to love each other. Well, the only way, logically, that he could do that would be to give us free will. Why? Because love always involves a choice. I'm going to really date myself, but when my daughter was little, I gave her a doll that was real popular for Christmas back then. It was called Chatty Cathy. Anybody remember Chatty Cathy? Yeah. So Chatty Cathy was this doll, and it had a string on the back. And you pull the string and let go, and the doll would talk to you. This is very primitive technology back then. So she would pull the string and let go, and the doll would say to her, I love you. That's how sophisticated it was. But did that doll love my daughter? No, of course not. It was a mechanical device. It had no choice. It was programmed to say that. Real love always involves a choice. And what have we done with our choice? We turned our back on God. We've hurt each other. We've introduced, 90% of the suffering in the world is things we do to each other. We hurt each other. We suppress the evidence for God. We've opened the door for moral and natural evil to enter into the human experience. I mean, even the planet is corrupted. The Bible says the planet is groaning for the ultimate day of redemption. And we've chosen to hurt each other. I mean, I can take my hand and using my free will, I can feed a hungry child. Or I can take that same hand and I can pick up a gun and I can kill an innocent person. But if I choose to pick up a gun and kill an innocent person, seems to me it's a little disingenuous to say, well, God, why do you allow suffering? Many times we're the problem. We're the problem. But here's the deal. Jesus didn't just tell us the obvious that in this world we're going to have trouble. I quoted part of John 16:33. Let me give you the whole verse. Jesus said, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but have courage because I have overcome the world. In other words, when we suffer, Jesus is saying, I can give you the two things you need the most. I can give you peace for the present, and I can give you courage for the future. In fact, Romans 8:28 says, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, he can cause all things in our life, our suffering. He can cause all things to work together for good if we follow him, if we're called according to his purpose. And some people quote that verse almost like a greeting card. Somebody has something bad happen. Romans 8:28, God can cause all things to work together for good. But you know what? It is from Scripture. It is true. And if you say to yourself, you know what? I've suffered too much. My wife has suffered 20 years. It's too much. How can God draw anything good from that? I asked Dr. Kraft that. You know what he said? He said, think about this. God took the worst possible thing that could ever happen in the universe, which is the death of the Son of God on a cross. And from that, he created the best thing that's ever happened in the universe, which is the opening of heaven to all who follow him. And so if God can take the worst thing in the universe and turn it into the best thing in the universe, he can take in this world or the next our suffering and draw good from it. And I believe we can trust him for that. There's so much more to this issue, but Dr. Kraft does such an amazing job of explaining it. I was so encouraged by his interview, and I know you will be too. But what's the bottom line to all this? What's the bottom line? It's simply this. Number one, God is real. God is real. That's good news that God is real. But there's better news than God being real. You know what the better news is? Not only is he real, we can have a personal relationship with him in this world, and we can be assured of spending eternity in his perfect presence forever, a place of no suffering, no pain, no sorrow. That's the best news of all. And so I hope if you're a follower of Jesus, the Bible tells us all in 1 Peter 3:15, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. So many of our friends have a spiritual sticking point. They don't know if God is real. They wonder, is God real? So let's help them. Let's help them get past that sticking point. Let's listen to them. Let's respect their questions. Let's help them wrestle with them and find answers to satisfy their heart and soul. Or if you're here tonight and maybe a friend brought you and you say, I'm not sure where I stand with God. I don't know. Can I tell you something? God does not want you living in a state of ambiguity or a state of confusion. The first verse I ever memorized as a new Christian comes from 1 John. It says, these things were written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, in order that you may know that you have eternal life. Do you know? Do you know? Well, you can know. And in a few minutes, Lucas is going to come up, and he's going to give you an opportunity, if you want to cement that once and for all, to come into a personal relationship with him. But first, before we do that, you know, we've talked tonight, we've sung some wonderful worship songs. We've heard about the evidence of science, of cosmology and physics and biochemistry that points toward the existence of God. We've heard a summary of the resurrection evidence that convinces us that Jesus is his unique son. And so, we're going to sing one other song, one of my favorites, How Great Thou Art. How great thou art. So why don't we stand and let's sing together this incredible ancient hymn. God bless you all. Thank you for having me.